Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining. And big thank you to Chris Mandel for agreeing to battle it out with me on a very fascinating topic of enterprise risk management or enterprise-wide risk management. I don't know what the difference is. Hopefully, today we'll find out. Um, the setup for today is very straightforward. We will start up with some introductions. We will then go back and forth, trying to argue different points, trying to share ideas, trying to answer questions. And hopefully, in that process, both myself, Chris, and all of you participating in our online discussion will learn something valuable about risk management in general, or maybe ERM specifically. And while we're having this conversation for approximately 45 minutes, feel free to ask any questions you want in the chat that you see on the right side of your screen. Make sure you type up your questions. We will not be answering them as we go through, just not to interrupt the flow of the conversation, but we will try and get back to every single question that you've posted in the chat after our kind of main discussion. And whatever we haven't been able to capture, we'll get back to you online or through through some of the videos that I have on the Risk Academy channel, for example. So that's the logistics of today. It will be interesting, fascinating, hopefully super controversial, because that's what life is all about. And I mean, politically, our presidents, I think, have done everything to make this entertaining. Um, so a Russian, arguably with an Australian passport, but it doesn't matter. A Russian battling the American on the topic of risk management. First, I again once again would like to thank Chris for agreeing to do this. And Chris, maybe you can do a quick intro, tell our participants, our audience, a little bit about yourself and
Yeah,
what
sure.
has your experience been in risk.
Sure. Good morning, Alex. Good to see you again. I think we last met in Dubai last year. I've been in the risk management game for decades, I suppose. Started my career in the insurance world and brokerage world, and then quickly found my way into what I really love doing, which is, large global corporate risk. So I've been head of risk operations for entities as wide and far flung as Red Cross to Verizon to PepsiCo to USAA. And, for most of my career, I practiced what I call traditional risk management, which is really hazard based. And then, as we came to the turn of the century and I was in the lineup to lead the Risk Management Society, I decided I needed a platform. And the platform I decided on was enterprise risk, for lack of a better term. And all I was really doing was acknowledging that, I wanted to do something more than the more narrow discipline that I'd been practicing most of my career, which was, as you know, the way risk management was defined, in many cases still is defined. And so for that period beginning in 2001, I really turned my attention to what I call the broader, more progressive scheme. And I've been doing it, consistently up through the time when I took my current role, which is as a senior vice president of strategic solutions at Sedgwick, and I'm also the head of the Sedgwick Institute, which isn't at its core about enterprise risk management, but I still play in that space, still stay connected to it, as you know, have a lot of opinions about it, and looking forward to talking to you and our audience today about those issues.
Excellent. Thank you very much. For those of you who came through Chris's group and may not know who I am, my name is Alex. I've been in risk for 14 years, so much shorter time. Um, However, my background started in a different part of the world. My background in risk started in Australia, which at the time, many years ago, proposed a different school of thought to what was happening in North America in general. And interestingly, after working in consulting, I moved into head of risk roles at the government-based investment funds, sovereign funds, and government-based entities in Russia, because I thought, what is a fun place to work? Because Australia seemed a little bit boring. So I thought, what is a fascinating, highly volatile, completely unpredictable, and super risky place to work? So Moscow sounded like a fun place. Um, However, as I later discovered, I'm actually a pretty good risk manager in life, as it turns out, because uh, 2 years ago, I resigned from my role as the head of risk of one of the multi-billion-dollar government agencies, and moved my whole family to live in Spain, where we are having amazing fun right now. And you may have seen some of the videos I regularly do and post to the Risk Academy channel on YouTube, that I shoot somewhere near the sea, somewhere in Spain. So that's a little bit about ourselves. You know who your
Or,
speakers
or,
for
or in
today.
the case of this morning, in front of a bale of hay, right?
Yeah, which is actually quite hilarious. I do have a video on ERM specifically, and it was shot in front of the bale of hay. However, one of the most liked comments and one of the most popular comments was, "Is that manure?" No, it wasn't. It was just hay. Um, would be
That
pretty
must have
extreme.
come from a city slicker, right? Yeah.
I imagine, because it doesn't look anything like. Um, so that's a little bit of intro about ourselves. And I guess the first question, to kind of get the ball rolling and have the conversation um, progress from here. The first question is, what is Chris? What is ERM to you?
So that's, on the one hand hard and on the one hand easy. So I would tell you that ERM is what risk management should have always been. And there's lots of history behind where ERM actually came from. But I mean, the truth of the matter is that, it kind of the risk function kind of evolved from a procurement insurance buying orientation, at least in North America, to, something that became more focused on not just how do you finance risk, or in that case, insure it, but to prevent it and control it, right? So I look at it as a three-legged stool. How do you prevent bad things from happening? How do you finance them? And how do you control them and mitigate them after the fact? Um, but ERM, in my mind, is just a couple of additional easy things. It's all risk on the one hand, or let's say all significant risk, right? Because we can get bogged down real quickly in, hundreds, if not thousands of risks. Doesn't mean all those don't need to be managed, but it does mean that there are the more significant things that, can kill you, can kill your organization, can make a huge dent in your, your strategic and operational commitments. So it's all risk. And then, to my way of thinking, it's as much about the upside of risk as the downside. Or the way I like to translate it is as much about value preservation, the downside, as value creation, or at least it should be. And so, if there's another third piece, it's just more about the focus on stakeholders, because it isn't all about, at any stretch, about you as a risk leader or you as a risk department or any singular thing. It's about everyone that's got a stakeholder interest in risk management.
Hmm. Okay, that's very interesting. Um, the, uh, I guess the kind of, if I was to think about what is ERM to me, understanding the background, I did grow up in Australia, and that kind of comes with the Australian school of thought. And sorry, I'm gonna fix quickly one technical issue. Regular. Somebody's having technical issues, but that should be fine.
Yeah. So to get you focused again, Alex, what is ERM to you?
Yeah, yeah. And my short answer to that is, I struggle, because not only ERM didn't really come to Australia quite late, not only came kind of on the back of a consulting world, and hence was positioned more as a marketing concept as opposed to a useful concept. Not only that, but more importantly, risk management in general, risk management in general has never really been just about risk financing and insurance. The way risk management kind of slowly evolved, because maybe the evolution of risk management into that non-financial side started in Australia much earlier, or maybe it evolved quicker. I actually don't know. But the starting from very early 2000s, when I learned my field, like I actually I was kind of funny, lucky and unlucky at the same time, because I have a degree in risk management. I have an undergraduate degree in risk management, which was the first ever graduate intake in the country. So I studied risk management in university, and we had textbooks, and Australian Standard was our textbook for the first year. So everything we were kind of learning from the very beginning already was the risk management you talk about, which is both about the protecting the downside and improving the upside of business and decision making. So maybe for me that was the challenge. The ERM kind of came late to the game and came with the concept, positioning as something groundbreaking or unique or amazing, which was always the case. So I was maybe more like confused, like what are you talking about? This is how we've always done it. That's on one side, but on the second side, I conceptually agree with everything you say. With the only kind of follow up is that risk management has to be super practical and super pragmatic, and for every word that any of us say, there has to be a very physical implementation. So what does it actually mean? How does a document look like? Is that a document, or is it not? Is it something else? Like, what are the actual physical things that are happening in the organization that chose to go in the path of implementing risk management? And what I have discovered as I kind of moved to a different country, as I started working on, for example, the global PwC team rewriting the internal risk management methodology, what I started seeing is that the documents that organizations that claimed they were on the ERM path, the documents that they have created were actually really bad. They've actually created so much bureaucracy claiming it was ERM. So in my mind, ERM always associated with something much worse than many Australian businesses did, which never claimed to be ERM type implementations. So in my mind, I actually don't 100% know what is this beast ERM. And my key argument is you can just call it risk management. It actually doesn't change anything.
Right.
And so over to you.
Well, so one of the things we talked about, addressing today was usefulness, right, or lack thereof, and so I think that's at the heart of it. To your point, it doesn't matter what we call it, but understand, and I'll just just kind of add a little bit more to the history, because you're right. I think the Australians and the South Africans and others were a bit of ahead of the game, because in the U.S. anyway, as I say, this thing was a procurement insurance buying function for the longest time. And frankly, the Risk Management Society was based on that originally. And a lot of its members still are in that kind of milieu of that form of practice. And I always say, it's what your company needs. So if your company just needs you as a quote risk leader manager to, handle the insurance and hazard risk function, well, so be it. It doesn't mean that somebody in the organization, lots of people typically don't need to address all the other risks, because the research shows that strategic risks are the most destructive by far, and they're the least insurable. Let's put it that way. So is it useful or not? Well, I would say, to your point, it could be as detrimental to an organization in certain forms than it is helpful and useful. Because if it's bureaucratic, and most people don't work for bureaucratic organizations, or ones that want to be bureaucratic, they're looking for simplicity and clarity and things that add value. So, I think when you take it out of a box off a shelf and you try to jam it in, as some people do, you're destined for failure, and that's normally taking the form of, something defined as an A to Z approach to ERM, with all the different component parts, some of which we'll touch on today. So to me, it boils back to, what does your organization need? And then, are you equipped to provide it? And who are you going to engage in that process of providing it? And what are we asking to provide, regardless of what we call it? In my view, it's the intelligence about making decisions with useful information like risk information that informs that decision making process. Everything else is superfluous. I mean, all the tools, techniques, and everything else uh, may or may not be needed or necessary, let alone useful, if you can accomplish that central goal. What do you think about that?
I absolutely agree. In fact, um, there are a couple of well, actually, picking up on your point, there are for our audience, there are a couple of research papers that you've just referenced. It's one by the executive board and the other one by Deloitte called "The Value Killers." It's a fascinating study where the researchers have taken 1,000 biggest corporate collapses that happened over the 40-year period. There's actually Value Killers 1 and Value Killers 2. There are two research papers. They've taken 2,000 companies over 40 years, and they've tried to nail down what are the underlying reasons why companies lose more than 20% of their market share, sorry, of their of their capitalization, and some go bankrupt and never recover. And interestingly, strategic risks, what they classify as strategic risks, classification is another story. But what they classify as strategic risk is by far the biggest one. This is where I think consultants, rightly so. I mean, consultants. When I say consultants, mainly PwC who wrote USAA ERM. This is what they've realized is a kind of the sweet spot for both selling and adding value, because this is an area where value needs to be added. It is by far the most dangerous area for the business, and they kind of try to target that with the concept of enterprise risk management, saying, well, position it as something strategic or kind of executive board level type activity. I, on the other hand, very much like the other definition of risk management, or the other, not the definition in terms of like the words that they use, but the idea that the authors of ISO 31000 have put behind the definition of risk management. And in the ISO 31000, the definition of risk management is coordinate. I can't remember the exact wording. Check, our audience can check it in the actual standard, but it's something like coordinated activities for controlling and performing whatever business is performing with risks in mind. So it's basically the risk management is not identification, assessment, mitigation, reporting, and monitoring. Risk management is anything an organization does to achieve its objectives and make money and protect its reputation and enhance its shareholder value or stakeholder value if it's not profit, as long as it does it with risks in mind. Right. And that to me is a wonderful approach. Plus, it doesn't have to be called enterprise risk management. In fact, when you kind of call it enterprise risk management, it seems to be more narrow, unnecessarily narrow, than just saying risk management is basically anything a business does, as long as it's doing it with a conscious consideration for risk.
Right. And I think, frankly, when it's viewed as a kind of a separate discipline, it becomes a little more suspect, right? Because then some people, I mean, it literally becomes a bolt-on, as I like to say, to what already is going on. And I think that's probably one of the many reasons for its challenge in terms of acceptance, because no senior leadership team, no board wants to just bolt more stuff onto their strategy or their plan or their execution. And that's why I think the essence of this game, if it's a game, is really all about building it into the behavior of people. I mean, call it the risk-taking behavior of people, right? Which is a cultural thing, right? Which raises one of those many controversial, interesting questions about, is risk culture a real concept? Is it distinct from corporate culture? I say, it can be, but probably doesn't need to be. That's kind of the way I think about it. Because if you don't have the risk-taking behaviors that you want from people in some sense defined, modeled, and reinforced by the leadership, then you've got a risk culture, slash the way people make risk-taking decisions that is kind of Wild West, without any rigor, without any discipline. And I don't know how that could lead to anything but trouble, right? So, you know, let's agree maybe that, risk culture is really something that should be incorporated into corporate culture, and just be the answer to the question of how do you want people to behave with respect to
Yeah,
making decisions that should involve risk considerations.
yeah. I totally agree with that. In fact, like this is, yeah, I think you've pinpointed one of the biggest pains I have with the concept of enterprise risk management. It has enterprise and management, which are the good words, but it has the word risk in it, like in the right in the middle, which kind of implies that it's an enterprise way or approach to managing risks, making us believe as if managing risks was the objective in itself,
Yeah.
which I personally don't think it is. It's the objective is to make better decisions, operate better, better plan, better procure, better deliver on whatever the company strategy is. So to me, it kind of goes. I think the maturity is kind of going in the way the lowest. I'm trying to squeeze it into the frame. The lowest level of maturity is something risk management. So it's like, objective-centric risk management, like Tim Leach calls it, or enterprise risk management, actually doesn't matter. If you put risk management as the centerpiece of that topic, it implies that the whole reason why you would want to know and do that is to better manage risk, which of course is silly. The idea is not to better manage risk. The idea is to better manage organization with risks in mind.
Yeah.
So this is
Manage
like the first,
performance.
this is the lowest level of maturity, something risk management. Then the second level of maturity, which I think where I am mentally at the moment, is risk-based something. Risk-based decision making, risk-based budgeting, risk-based strategy, risk-based procurement. This is what I've tried to implement in the organization where I worked, and this is what I'm kind of trying to propose through all the videos and articles and the book. Is you have to, instead of doing something to better manage risk, you have to start planning or budgeting differently to take risks into account. And that's like the second level of maturity. But I think the third level of maturity, which is the future, hopefully we will get there, is just budgeting, just procurement, just strategy, and it will be assumed and implied that risks should be taken into account by default. There's no other way. But we're definitely not there yet. So I'm kind of trying to move away from this something risk to risk-based something. It's this trivial language play, but it actually completely changes the approach.
Yeah, you had me worried there for a minute. I mean, because I think when you start saying risk based this and risk based that, you kind of move backwards in some sense. But I understand your logic, and I think maybe it is evolutionary from something broad and without much discipline to something that fully integrates it into a way a corporation and organization does their business. Which I think is what you're saying. Ultimately you're getting to what some of us call the embedding of risk taking decision making into the way the organization operates. And there's got to be a path there. You don't just go from something risk management to that fully embedded corporate culture that gets everybody doing the right thing, by considering the risk, right? But what about it? Let me ask you a question that I think is pretty interesting and controversial, and that is, if an organization doesn't succeed, or let's make it very narrow, they miss a particular strategic objective. Is that always because they didn't manage a risk well? I mean, how would you answer that?
Well, it's a tough question because it can go million of directions. It's at least two things. Well, actually, no, it's at least three things. One is they never considered what the risks were, and they were surprised by either internal or external issues, and that happens quite often because I've seen quite a lot of strategic departments, and the scenario analysis that they run usually, or some of the sensitivity analysis that they usually run when they create and set and validate the strategy, are very, very weak. They exclude um, purposefully exclude a lot of significant risks to not make the strategy too realistic, to not scare people off. And there are a lot of political reasons why um, well, it's not as realistic as it possibly can. So I think the reason number one is they just completely ignored it and missed it and didn't do anything about it. The second reason why that may happen is they realized what is the potential issue or risk that may affect their strategic objective, and they just couldn't do anything about it. They didn't have the time or the budget or the competencies to deal with it. Somebody in the market may have dealt with that issue better than the company did. And the third one, which is also a possibility, because we are saying that risk management is not just about managing risks, and in fact, we are fine taking risks sometimes, and missing a strategic objective may be a conscious decision done by management as a sacrifice to something broader or bigger or more important. We've missed a lot of strategic objectives in my time as a sacrifice to something else. So yeah, I think all three can happen with different likelihoods depending on the country.
So I was thinking about this last night, and I kind of came to a few conclusions about the answer to the question: is it always about risk if failure occurs? And so, if risk is uncertainty and fortuity or fortuitous loss, then I'd say probably not. If risk is uncertainty and can be fortuitous, intentional, due to bad luck, and even incompetence, then maybe yes. But
I agree.
at the end of the day, I think I can sum it all up to that question by saying if you're executing your strategies and your tactics just on hope, then that probably doesn't cut it, right?
That's absolutely right. The fascinating thing is, and that's why risk management is actually much more scientific than just running a risk workshop and having a wonderful conversation with a group of friends. Human nature is such that no executives sit there and go, "Oh, we're just an opportunistic bunch, and let's hope for the best." No, most people are 100% confirmed and confident that they are doing the right thing. They 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 feel like they see the potential risks. They feel like they've got it under control. They feel like they actually are doing the best they can possibly do for their stakeholders, or at least for themselves, which is weird. I mean, there's so much research on these cognitive biases that I like talking a lot about. Is that most people are doing stupid things. I mean, people in generally are not that good at managing risks or making decisions under uncertainty in general. Not because they're stupid people. I mean, we know for a fact if you're an executive, you're by definition not stupid,
Yeah.
with very rare exceptions.
Doesn't mean you don't do
And
stupid things, though.
sorry.
Doesn't mean you don't do stupid things, though.
And yet we know for a fact that people do stupid things because thousands of companies have lost a lot of shareholder value over the years. It's a common occurrence now, and people do stupid things not because they're stupid, not because they're bad people. Again, although there are bad people out there, and
Sure.
business is not nice in general, but mainly because they believe they're doing the right thing at the time. They just completely ignored the analysis or never bothered to do any proper risk analysis to find out what the real risks are.
Right. So let me take this in a little bit of different direction before we leave this topic. So back in the day when I went to a particular company and I was hired to develop an ERM strategy, literally, they thought they needed it mainly because third party stakeholders like regulators were basically signaling that that was their expectation. Standard and Poor's in particular. Um, so I'm making the rounds with, company business unit presidents and asking, the typical first questions about this. How do you view this whole game of risk management? How do you think about managing risk in your business segment? And at that point, the company was pretty successful. And to each of those 5 or 6 business unit heads, they all were pretty uh, on point in terms of delivering, their objectives every year. And, so they're, to a person, their answer to me was, well, aren't I already managing risk well? Because I'm already meeting or exceeding most of my objectives every year. Isn't that the purpose and goal? And I'm not going to tell you what I said to them in response, but I'm interested in your answer to that question. What do you say to those people who say, aren't I managing my risk well by the evidence of my performance outcomes?
Yeah, well, that's actually a very good question. I mean, as a good risk manager, I would never answer that question, because I would do a lot more homework to understand, is it actually true or not. And
Mm.
the first thing I always did when I was the head of risk, and I had to have a similar conversation, because it's a pretty standard response. It's a pretty standard response. Everything's already under control. We're already doing fine. We know our risks better than anyone else. Um, you always double check. And I when I every time I start digging, and when I mean I start digging, I start looking at the budgets, I start looking at the actual spend, I start looking at the past projects, how much money was lost, how much money was made. You always find stuff. And sometimes once I found such an unbelievable stuff that just completely changed like the whole legislation for a specific industry in the whole country. So you do find fascinating things. As a risk manager, I would never believe any phrases like that for a second. I would
Interesting.
investigate. It may be, in fact, it may be the case. I mean, we never know. They may know the risks that they're facing quite well. Um,
No, your
it's
point
a
is well
matter of
taken.
double check.
Your point is well taken, actually, because in another experience in the same company, the CEO, when I gave him one of my early versions of reporting on the state of the union with respect to risk in that company, using the feedback from the risk owners as the basis for the reporting, which turned out to be, if you think about a stoplight version of a report, yellow, green, red stuff,
Yeah,
mainly green. And the CEO said to me, can't be that good. Just can't be.
yeah,
And so I think this raises a really interesting question for practitioners, and one that I've always it's been one of my hot buttons, which is to say, if there were a set of traits that risk leaders need to have, one of those traits needs to be what I call gumption, or maybe you call it guts, or, I'm sure every culture has a different word for it. But it's that ability to push back and say, not that I don't believe you or I think you're lying, but that, well, as Reagan used to say, right? You know, validate and whatever he said, verify and validate. And that's to your point, and what that takes is gumption, and what that takes is a certain amount of uh, knowledge about risk and specific risk areas to be able to even hold your own against risk owners or senior people who outrank you, by however many levels. That's an interesting challenge for risk leaders that run the gamut of, having a manager level title all the way up to chief risk officers. And even at the CRO level, they may or may not be equipped, to push back on a leader and say, I'm sorry, I don't agree. And you better be able to say why.
I have two quick stories on that, and both are fascinating. One was a business unit director who came to my office, and we had to prepare his investment thesis or his investment proposal, and part of that, of course, was risk analysis. And he was saying something that I kind of noticed, and that's why I repeat again, risk management is actually much more scientific than many people think. He was saying something that immediately triggered in my mind some of the little traps, the mental traps, the cognitive biases that I was sure he was falling into. So he was saying something which I knew for a fact would not be true. I didn't even have to verify whether it was true or not. He was just using the language and the body language, which clearly showed that he did not think of something, or he didn't do proper analysis. He was kind of just giving me excuses. And I just said, I've given him a little spiel about what the cognitive biases are, and I said, what you're saying is simply physically impossible to be true. So go back, verify, and come back. let's not even waste time on having this discussion, because I know that you're clearly deceiving yourself, and now you're trying to deceive me. So the guy was so upset that he complained to his VP that I was teaching him cognitive biases. Of course, he was deceiving me at the time, and we later discovered on all that when he continued to refuse to change his analysis, and we had to double check. And of course, we found all the deceptions. There's one thing. There's the kind of the human interaction thing, the skill that risk managers must have. And but by the way, my rule as the head of risk was I would never, under any circumstances, discuss risks over the phone or via email, because or any project or anything for that matter, which is kind of impossible if you're working in a huge corporation. But luckily for us, it was a relatively compact business, even though it was multi-billion dollars. But it was a relatively small team, only like 200 something, and that helped a lot. Not having actually having that face to face, not having this phone, helped a lot, because I could see when people were falling into different cognitive biases. That's one story. And the second story, which is why I say it's very scientific, you actually have to have a lot of corporate finance and finance and statistical knowledge in general. Our CFO at the time was telling everyone that risks are taken care of, because he discounts all the cash flows by like 40 or 30%. I can't remember what it was. And he was saying it so many times that I said, like, fine, I'm sick of it. I'm gonna double check. You've said it one time too many, so I'm going to double check. So I double checked, and out of every project, out of like 100 projects, his 30% rule applied only to less than a quarter of all the projects.
Mm-hmm.
The 3/4 were exceptions. So that was fascinating. He was promising that it was applied all across the board, so we don't have to worry about risk management at all.
Yeah.
And a small search investigation, digging with the numbers, uncovered that it was only applied to 1/4, less than 1/4 of the whole overall portfolio. And the others were exceptions. I just love it how close to 80% of your portfolio can be exceptions.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating stuff.
Okay, so I got to call you out on this, because since you haven't named the company, I think we're safe in digging a little deeper here. But if I remember, you told me these stories. And
I did, yeah.
This is in Russia, right?
Yes.
And these were companies, or at least one of them, right, that involved a fair amount of ultimately corruption. Am I right?
Corruption at different stages, yes.
Okay. So, and not to put you on the spot, but we're now talking about personal risk management, the ability to manage your own personal career risk when you push back in a way that is deemed unacceptable or too hard or whatever, calling people's integrity into question. I don't know how that ended for you, but let's address that topic, because I think if we're going to call people out to have gumption and gonads or whatever, then we need to equip them with the risk that's attendant to that.
Yeah, actually, I mean, that's a very fair question. I was very lucky in a way, because some of my friends used to drive in bulletproof cars, because of their work. I never had to. I was very fortunate. And both cases that I've just described, they were not the kind of the corruption fraud related cases. They were just people genuinely, and this is why I'm saying cognitive biases are so huge. People genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They were deceiving themselves, and then honestly trying to prove the case. They fully believed something,
Right.
but it wasn't the reality. It was something else. However, that being said, there were plenty of other instances where one thing, and I think one thing only, helped a lot. And whenever a risk manager is working, well, I'm a strong believer that risk managers has to be very, very brave and have a lot of guts to challenge things. And if we're saying ERM is about integrating into what the business does, integrating into decision making, integrating into strategy, integrating into budgeting, well, it's actually not that easy to come to the CFO or head of production or head of marketing or head of sales and say, well, why don't we change the way you've been budgeting for the last 15 years? Because there's a better way. And I can prove there's a better way, both mathematically and practically. The typical response is go away. There are probably some other more powerful words that are being used, or he may actually attack in response, retaliate. So those instances, if you're going to integrate into somebody else's processes, you're bound to impact on their bonus payments, on their power trips. So it is a very serious game. And there's only one thing that can really protect you. Well, there are a couple. One is to have someone sponsoring the whole thing. For example, chair of the board was a huge friend and a fan of risk management in general, and chair of the audit committee was a huge fan of risk management. That kind of gave a little bit of cushioning. But that's only for big battles. The second thing, which is the other 99% of the time, which is your day-to-day, and the very important, is to have a lot of friends who think similar to the risk manager. So for me, it was, for example, director of strategy, head of monitoring, head of internal audit, head of compliance, and head of security.
Yeah.
So these people were passionate about making better business or better governance, creating a better environment within the organization. Fighting those battles by yourself is insanity. It will physically affect, I think, risk managers' health. I don't think it's sustainable at all. But having a lot of friends does make a job a lot easier. So coming back to your question.
I like that approach. Yeah, because I mean, you're right. Having the mandate from the top and having the CEO's visible support, really important. Same across the spectrum of C-suite leaders. Hard to get it consistent, but just having it, at all is helpful. But getting relationships with stakeholders down is critical to your point, to manage your own personal risk, frankly. But ultimately to get it built into the culture, which is what I think we're saying here. I had another example in an entity where, I tried to convince the CEO that people were scared of him, that they wouldn't bring him their dirty laundry because he'd hand them their heads, and he did, but he wouldn't admit it. And yet the evidence was everywhere. And that's a fear-based management style and culture that can really be detrimental to the whole idea of getting, risk properly considered and effectively integrated into planning and decision making. So in those instances, I tell people, you can only go so far, and it may be that if you can't change it, to your liking, you may have to leave, and go practice your take your bag of tricks somewhere else. That's just
100%.
Yeah.
100% agree with that. And this is for some reason, for many risk managers, this is a reality. Like, this seems to be the pill too hard to swallow. But the reality is, I mean, you are doing a lot of very difficult things. You're changing the way people make decisions. Decision making is the most sensitive and complex area in the business. And if that just doesn't work, if your advice or your suggestions are constantly ignored, then really risk managers, it might as well be better off working somewhere else. I've had a couple of people commenting saying that losing a job is too difficult, and I'm just going to stick around and do the quarterly risk register update for the sake of updating the quarterly risk registers because it kind of pays my salary. It's really an individual choice. I don't think I'm in a position to kind of judge whether that's a good or a bad choice. I, for example, quite clearly have made my choice. I had no trouble resigning from the company where I worked, even though we're still friends and we're still in contact, and I still do some work for them from time to time. But it's it wasn't the right feel for the kind of the personal risk management and well-being of the family.
Yeah. Hey, so I think before we get into Q&A, which I know is coming up, we ought to at least touch on frameworks and standards and things like that, because I mean, you and I think, are both, devotees of ISO 31000. But, I think the question for a lot of people is, do I need a standard and do I need a formal framework in order to successfully get risk managed well within my organization? How would you answer that question?
That's a very, very good question, and I think it deserves a simple answer. Risk management, integrating risk management, is a very complex activity, and it's as much about selling it to the stakeholders as it is about actually physical implementation and the delivery. So there's the mathematical side of it. You have to be able to quickly calculate 10,000 scenarios, for example, and be able to provide and explain what all of this means. That's the technical skill. But the real problem risk managers have is that many people can calculate. Not many people have an opportunity to calculate in the first place. So it took me 1 year to convince the CFO to give me access to his overall strategic budgeting model. So then I was able, within days, to produce different scenarios and test different hypotheses and model some of the risks and see whether we did or did not have a liquidity problem. But it took a year to get access to an Excel file. Risk
Mhm.
management, like, this is the fun part of the implementation. It actually gets down to it. How quickly can you get access to a specific Excel file? And it may take months. So it's about selling the need for risk management and the value that risk management generates. And a single person just coming from the street or coming from inside the organization and saying, we need to do risk management because it sounds good, um, is just not going to cut it. So me as the head of risk, I need to have standards, not because of what the content they say inside, that as well, but more importantly, the very existence of a standard. Because I need a piece of paper to take to someone and say, we are doing this because the ISO says so, or the stock exchange says so, or the Ministry of Finance says so. In fact, because I was working in government-based organizations, we saw most legislation, most draft legislations. And my friends from the legal department would call me and say, look, the Ministry of Economics is referencing risk in this particular piece of legislation that's coming up. Do you want us to delete it? Because they will come to you. I said, no, I want to rephrase it. I want it there because that's a little hook that when it comes later, I will be able to justify whatever I'm doing by saying it's not me, it's the Ministry of Economics that said I should do this. So I was actually looking for all those different hooks. So to me, standards are hooks, and a standard is useful as long as it actually doesn't go into too much detail. And that's the problem with COSO. With the previous COSO, now they've just turned to complete, you rubbish. But the previous one, it actually went into a lot of detail. It prescribed specific things, like you had to do this and that. You have to have. It was too much information, and external auditors, they're very simple-minded, and internal auditors, they see, they do. So they read it and they started asking questions, all the wrong questions, because risk managers never needed, or some of the documents that were referenced in the 2004 version of COSO. Um, but anyway, that's why I personally love ISO 31000 so much, because it's 14 pages. It doesn't say anything. You can literally do absolutely anything you feel like, and you can justify it by using ISO 31000, by referencing ISO 31000. And it actually has a lot of good keywords. There's a lot of decision making in the new 2018 version. It has all the right keywords. So for me, it's a wonderful document to take to any of the executives and say, we need to do this because the standard kind of implies that we should.
Yeah, but weren't you lamenting the fact that ISO had dropped the risk maturity concept?
Um, I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure they have dropped it.
Oh, I
In
thought you said
fact,
they
I'm
did.
actually, yeah, I'm actually thinking that it may be coming up quite soon. They're working
Okay.
on another document that will kind of capture that.
Well, let me give you my 2 cents on standards and frameworks. As you know, I do like ISO 31000,
Please,
but to me,
please.
I mean, it's not a mandate, it's not a requirement. It can be helpful. It can be helpful in applying discipline and rigor and consistency if you need it. It can help jumpstart a new risk strategy that you're trying to deploy, but you need that flexibility, and not necessarily the granularity or the granular prescriptive nature of some of the way people think about this. And I mean, it may be the auditors and accountants that drive that granularity. I don't know, but at the end of the day, I think you need innovation and not the status quo. Always thinking about how to make things better and how to improve it. So I know we're running out of time, but I think a lot of people might wonder, can I really aspire to be a chief risk officer, or is that even necessary for organizations to be successful, or is it actually an anathema to success in risk management? What do you think about the CRO concept?
It's a very, again, very, very challenging question because thank you, Chris. None of the questions have a simple yes or no, yes or no answer.
No, they don't. Yeah.
When I did my kind of travel around the European consulting offices, because I was one of the creators of the global PwC risk methodology, so I had to travel to few offices and do training on what the methodology was. I had a slide which basically said by 2020, organizations should not have risk professionals at all. And of course, I meant non-financial organizations, because in financial organizations, the regulators still expect to have them, and they want to separate the decision-making from the sales office. But in non-financial companies, my hypothesis was that risk managers should disappear because risk management will be integrated into everything a business does. Well, since then, I have done a lot of research into how people actually make decisions, and it sounds like the way our brain works at the chemical level is very different to what we think to how we think our brain works. And basically, people are unreliable, and not very rational. They're driven a lot by money, greed, and lack of information and confusion and many other factors. So it sounds like uh, the business processes will never become risk-based by themselves. Somebody will have to kind of push it. And even, for example, I've managed to integrate risk management into investment decision making and strategic planning. It was a complete integration. So we've reshaped all the documentation, all the methodologies, all the templates, and we've actually changed all the reports. So we've completely integrated into two business processes. And what we've discovered very soon is that unless you do it yourself, it is not going to happen. So unless you physically take the model from the finance people and run the scenarios yourself, they will not have the time, the competencies, or the desire, or they're motivated to do something else. They're motivated to finish the budget or to finish the strategic plan sooner rather than later. They don't want to be challenged. They don't want to challenge the executives. They don't have the balls to challenge the executives sometimes.
Yeah.
So, answering your question, do we need
Well,
a chief risk officer or a risk manager in general? In my personal opinion, I think we kind of have to. We can't really get away without one. But what do you think on that?
Well, I've always said, we should always be working ourselves out of jobs, but the reality of that is you probably never really do get there because I mean, that's a state of affairs that, is really hard to achieve even over the long haul. So, I think to me, it's more about, influence. It's more about credibility, knowledge than it is about title. If you are somebody that can contribute to meaningful, particularly strategic discussions, and bring the risk perspective to the table in a way that informs and educates others, I think that's what really matters. And whether or not your company ever acquiesces to making you a chief risk officer or whatever probably doesn't matter. I mean, we all want more money. We all want more recognition. It just takes different forms. And so I'm going to prognosticate that the majority of firms around the world particularly outside of FI, are never going to get there. They don't want another member of the C-suite, let alone a guy that or gal that says they're the risk expert in the organization. But they certainly need that person in most cases. And so I would just say, aspire to it, and yet don't fall on your petard over it.
I think it actually may happen because the executives don't really want somebody to challenge them, even though the Catholic Church in the past, I don't think any longer, but in the past they used to have a role which was called the devil's advocate, which is essentially what risk manager is all about. But Catholic Church dropped it, so I'm not sure whether maybe
They
it didn't
literally had
work
a
that.
job title called the Devil's Advocate. Is that right?
Yes, it was one person whose specific job was to argue against sainthood for whoever they were discussing.
Oh, that's interesting.
So he had to challenge everything basically.
That's interesting.
So that's the kind of role the risk manager has to play, and obviously the other executives are not going to be happy about that. However, the board members, the shareholders, they want that person. They want
Yeah,
somebody to challenge the decision makers.
yeah,
So maybe there is a role for the risk manager because if he's not if he's not if he can't become a trusted advisor to all of the executives, but the CEO will probably want somebody to challenge, and the board members will definitely want somebody to challenge.
well, if they don't want it, they definitely need it, whether they want it or not. So we're at about, as I counted, 57, 58 minutes. So do we have any questions we need to answer from the audience?
Yes, let me scroll back, and I will read out the question, and hopefully we can quickly respond to that. Perhaps we could view risk management or ERM in light of different disciplines. For example, accounting has many sub-disciplines such as financial management or legal profession, um, where there are many variable disciplines. Not 100% sure. Maybe Joseph, you can
It's more of a
clarify on that.
statement, more of a statement than a question.
Yeah. However, the next question that Joseph asking is a very good one. How do we measure the value of risk management?
That's always a good one, right? Because, on the one hand, if you can't quantify your results, you're already behind the curve, right? So, I mean, and this goes to the thing we didn't get to, which I think is a very important part of this conversation, and that is, why is the value proposition so difficult to translate in so many environments? And I think in part it's because quantification is limited, but that's not to say everything needs to be quantified. What I think it boils back to is, after you've got your ability to influence and your credibility established, it's really, in my mind, about showing quick and regular wins, even if they're small and even if they're soft. Being able to show, this is what we've added in terms of value this quarter or whenever, and then being able to articulate that clearly, not just hoping they'll see it as beneficial, but the consensus among stakeholders is that it is beneficial. So the value proposition for ERM, even generic risk management, I think will always be challenging because the days of just being able to say you cut the cost of risk by 5 or 10%, while that's still something that's being regularly reported to CFOs and others, doesn't really tell any real story except about one element of his spend. So, what are your thoughts?
Um, I've written an article on that, and the title of the article was "Can risk management even be effective? Is it physically possible?" Um, and I was basically saying exactly the same as what you said, but I did propose four quite specific things that you can look at to make a quick judgment whether risk management is effective and whether it's valuable. When I say effective, it's the same as valuable.
Yeah.
So any of our viewers can very quickly judge whether whatever they're doing in their work is valuable to the business and hence effective. And it's three things. Thing number one, have a look at how decisions are made within the organization, how executives, how directors, how the board members make decisions. If there is active, consistent, structured, systematic addressing or thinking of risks when making a decision, that's a pretty good sign risk management adds value. Decisions change significantly if risk is integrated into the actual preparation of the decision and calculation of the decision. Decisions change significantly. Like we've had data centers moved to different cities because we've added risk analysis on top of the normal decision-making process. So, for example, a you know the director was proposed in one city and it looked perfect on paper, but when we added risk analysis, when we did risk analysis on top of that, the decision changed completely. So it affects decisions significantly. The second thing to look at is what people think about and perceive about risk. Are they open about discussing risks? Um, are they honest with themselves about how significant risks are? Basically, the kind of the cultural aspect of it, something that you've talked about, that risk culture. Again, I also think it's a made-up story. There's just corporate culture, and risk is just one element of it, or one aspect of it. But you have to speak to the people and see whether they see value in risk management. Again, I saw that happen. I saw some executives, after we've saved his butt by doing proper risk analysis, he just he suddenly believed in risk management. And more importantly, I mean, this is just something that you would never hear. We had one of the discussions, and there was an opportunity that he was proposing an investment, an additional investment in the project that wasn't going so well. And the executives was asking, so like, for example, he would say, like, give me 1 million. And the executive was saying, so what kind of return are you going to give us back on that million? Like, how much are we going to get back? And he's going, oh, no. This million is 95% at risk. That means we're probably going to get 5,000 or 50,000 back. And don't expect to get anything else back. Like, this is the saving million. This million is going to be gone. Can you imagine somebody coming to the executive and saying, give me 1 million and you'll never see it again? But you do it because we have to mitigate other risks, other political and social risks. I mean, I was blown away, because to have the guts to tell that to the executives, that's unbelievable. So second, of course, is the culture. And the third one, risk management, is actually saving a lot of money through reduced insurance costs, better financing costs, reduced cost of goods. So having a look at how organizations kind of disclose what they have to the external world, what they publish in the annual report, what's available on the website, what they put in the different proposals and the different communications with stakeholders. That's the final thing to kind of see whether risk management is valuable, because risk management has to save actual money for the business.
Right. Yeah, and to your second point, I mean, it's all about risk reward when you get right down to it, right? And if you got people considering the risk and reward associated with decisioning, then you're probably pretty far down the road of where you need to be culturally.
Yep. Next question is for you, Chris. Chris, you've moved away from insurance to risk management, to even broader perspective in your career. How do you convince, or how can you convince risk managers who still focus primarily on insurance that there's more value in the broader enterprise perspective to risk?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think I might have said it in some form earlier, but I mean, I really do believe you should do what your company needs you to do. And the truth is, in many of my jobs, I was hired to manage the hazard insurable risk function. And that's what I did. There wasn't, in most cases, any latitude for, going much beyond that until my last key role, where the goal was, the purpose of my hiring was both to fix a broken corporate insurance function and to create a broader strategy. So, that's got to be the first question. What's the need? And then manage to the need. If the need is only defined as somebody who needs to manage the insurance or hazard risk function, and you want to do something broader, then it's obvious. You need to then take the bull by the horns and make the case for how bringing some of these other elements to the table, the things that we've been talking about that do have value, that ultimately change the culture of companies. Not an easy thing, not a quick thing, is something that will earn you a lot of points will earn you, hopefully, promotions, will get you paid better, and will advance your career. That's my perspective. But you've got to be in the right place to do it. And after hitting your head against the wall for enough time where there is no appetite for it, and I've been there, you need to move on.
It's so true. I've actually I've actually had a conversation with the CEO once where I brought a complete revolution, basically revolution. The stuff that we were doing was revolutionary already, but I brought like the next level. And I said, I don't trust some of the departments, so I propose that I completely outsource all of the risk analysis to the risk team. And we are not in any way corrupted, and hence we would provide better insight to the decision makers. And he said, no, I don't want that. I want people to own and take responsibility, just because you have to teach them and you have to work with them. So he said, no, I don't have appetite for a revolution. I have to take small steps. So
Right.
it's actually it sounds so obvious, but how many people really do that? Is have the conversation with the chair of the board, chair of the CEO, and chair of the audit committee, and just like, how far can I go? How far can I integrate? Like, what are the key decisions that we need to change? Because you
Right.
can't really change everything. It's too much, too
Well, and
much for a
frankly,
single person.
I'm sure you've seen, because I've seen it up close and personal, where CEOs have tried to turn an organization on its head because they thought it needed to be. They've usually failed, especially if that wasn't the real need. And I can think of one really explicit example that obviously I can't name, but that's exactly what happened. And 7 years into that initiative, that CEO was walked out.
Yep. So revolutions are fun, but only in the in the short term. Next question, which is again a very good one. So thank you, John, for asking that question. What is the balance of being an independent function versus providing support for risk-informed decision making across an enterprise? What are your thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, that whole issue of independence, which we all argue for, the auditors believing that they aren't a part of management, they need to have independence, is an interesting parallel situation for risk. But at the end of the day, I don't know whether you agree or not, Alex, but I would say risk management is a management function, and so independence to me is important only in a certain small quadrant of the risk leader's accountability. And that is what we had been talking about earlier, where you're trying to bring the truth to power. Let's call it that, right? And you're trying to
Mm.
elicit from those that hold the keys to the real answer, the risk owners and the risk process owners, to get them to tell it like it is. And then in a typical risk leader scenario at the enterprise level, you're the one that has to translate the message for the leadership of the organization to understand to the extent they need and want to understand it. So, that's just a small part of the job, because I think the main part of the job is providing the tools, techniques, advice, counsel, and guidance to enable the business to do what they should do with respect to risk.
I agree 100% with that. I always say, I mean, not just risk management is a management a function. I say risk management is a management decision making tool in general. So yes, 100%. Independence was never really an issue for me. It was more keeping sanity, not getting involved in some of the games that the business units play, and that's why it's kind of still important to report somewhere close to the CEO, so you're not influenced by the CFO who's asking you to hide all the financial risks and not talk about liquidity, or not, the head of legal counsel not asking you to hide some of the legal or compliance issues. So basically, you have to sit somewhere where you have access to all the information while nobody is trying to influence you too much by
Would it
what
be, would it
you
be
do.
would it be safe to say you're not an advocate for reporting directly to the board or the audit committee?
It's For risk management, I actually don't see how that can physically be possible.
Yeah.
I mean, risk management within, like, literally within hours, you discover so much, and it's all super sensitive.
Yeah.
And it's not like CEOs are reporting everything to the board and the audit committees. It's all sugar coated. No, as soon as the very second you report to the board or the audit committee, it becomes risk manager against the CEO. And I mean, you can play that battle if you want, but
You're
immediately
likely to lose it though in the long run.
you're guaranteed to lose it in the long run. Don't forget who pays your salary,
Yeah,
and more importantly, even if they will be maybe intimidated to fire you because it will look bad, but you will be completely cut out of decision-making process. So
yeah,
if you want to integrate into decision making, which happens at the management level, and you're reporting to the board, you will not be given access. I mean, it took me a year to get access to the financial model. You will never get access to the financial model because what the financial model that the board sees has nothing to do with the financial model that the management discusses.
yeah. So let me add another attribute to what I said risk leaders should have besides influencing, credibility, gumption. They need to be trusted, right? I mean, literally, the idea of being a trusted advisor is the right label, and we need to always be thinking about how we not only develop but maintain that trust factor.
Yeah. And that actually comes back to your comment. If you're working in a toxic environment where you don't, as a risk professional, you don't want to be trusted by that CEO or that CFO, then really you should look for a different place because risk manager has to be a trusted advisor to the CEO and bring ammunition to the CEO when he makes decisions. If you, as a risk professional, have no trust in the CEO's ability to make decisions, then you really have to try and look for a different CEO.
All right.
Next questions. Where do you see King 4 featuring? King 4 being the corporate governance code of South Africa. I'll be honest, I haven't read it yet, so even though it's been out for a while, so I don't know the
Yeah, I
answer to
can't
that
answer
question.
that either. I do know
What
I've heard
about
that it's one of the more robust perspectives on risk. But I don't know enough detail about it to really assess that.
same? What about ORSA, ORSA as a standard best practice for ERM, based on the concept of the use test? Lou is asking. Are you familiar with that standard?
Yeah, Orso is applicable to insurance companies. And, I think what people have found in the US particularly is that it's, those that became compliant, if you will, with Orso expectations and requirements who hadn't gone down the ERM road found themselves with a fairly robust approach to ERM once done. I think, though, it's somewhat peculiar to, insurance world in the sense that it relies to some degree on your ability to quantify risk, which, actuarially is very possible, very likely to be achievable in the insurance space. And so, because so much of the rest of us outside of insurance and financial services may or may not have the need for, let alone the ability to quantify risk, I think that's where you would say it has limited application.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And thank you for all the people who've been writing comments, not just questions, but interacting with one another and providing links with some interesting research. And some of you picked up on cognitive biases as well, and the neuroscientific research that was done there. I think that those are all the questions that we have. If you have any more questions, there's maybe one last opportunity to send it through. Otherwise, thank you so much for your time, Chris. Big thank you for you. Wonderful conversation as always. I enjoyed it
Can I just give
immensely.
them a quick 60 seconds on the way forward from my
Of
perspective?
course, a
I
very
think,
good idea.
and we've said it, but I'll repeat it. Do what your organization needs. So assess those needs, differentiate them from the wants, focus on the needs, um, and realize that there's going to be different drivers for this stuff. Understand what the relative importance of those drivers are, whether it's regulatory expectations, board level expectations, ideally, hopefully, drivers that come from the expectations of the business itself, which I think gets the most traction at the end of the day. Um, Try to get it embraced, try to get it endorsed, get that mandate, and then ultimately try to get it reinforced. The best way to engage a cultural change initiative is by getting the CEO particularly engaged in reinforcing whatever you're trying to do on a recurring and regular basis. Then the message gets through. It's not just you kind of crying in the wilderness. It's evident that it matters to the people that have the power in the organization. And then ultimately, be sure you know why. Be sure you know why you're doing what you're doing for your organization. Because if you don't, you're just going to flounder and flop around.
That's a very good point. And I also want to bring everyone's attention to the fact that there's been a lot of literature now. I think everybody's now talking about it. It was kind of weird a few years ago, like 7 years ago, when we started talking about decision making. But now I think it's generally accepted that the future of risk management is better decision making and integrating into decision making and using different risk management tools to improve decision making. And I wanted to leave you with a very interesting thought. This is almost a quote from ISO 31000, and the section is called Implementing Risk Management. So these are the 3 steps, and that's all there is in that section. Yeah, so it's a very high-level document. The 3 steps on how to implement risk management. Step number 1: find how significant decisions are made within the organization. Step number 2: change the way significant decisions are being made within the organization, obviously to integrate risk. And step number 3, I can't remember. And there is probably like 5 or 6 more words, but this is it. This is the section on this is your answer to the question, how do you implement risk management? Like, what do you do? Well, this is what you do. You find how decisions are made, you take the most significant ones, and you change the process on how the decision is made. So you change the procurement procedure, or you change the strategic planning manual, or finance policy, or investment guidelines. You change existing documents outlining how decisions are made, which is a huge jump from our traditional approach. Because if 5 years ago, if we asked anyone, or even last year, if we asked anyone, how would you implement risk management, 90% probably would say you develop a risk management framework, you run interviews, run a workshop, and discuss a risk profile, and then you prepare a risk report. These words are not even mentioned in the current, recently 3 or 4 or 5 days published ago ISO 31000.
Yeah.
So I think this is fascinating stuff. I mean, we are on the verge of something very interesting for the risk professionals.
I agree. Very well put, and good way to wrap this up. So listen, Alex, I appreciate you inviting me to do this. It's been a pleasure sharing some thoughts and opinions with our audience. I do think I need to go now check with Donald Trump and figure out what my grade is on this. You should do the same with Putin, and then we'll know where we're sitting.
Yes. But we're both on the list, that's for sure.
All right, man. You take care.
Speak to you later. Thank you,
So long,
everyone.
everybody.